July 26, 1943. North of New Guinea, low over the water, a Japanese transport plane is banking hard toward shore, trying to reach the airstrip at Cape Gloucester. An American bomber is already closing in, low and fast, and carrying something no one in the Pacific had ever fired from a moving aircraft before. A 75mm cannon, the same gun bolted to the side of a Sherman tank. The American pilot steadies his approach, uses his .50 caliber tracers to walk the aim point forward, then pulls the trigger on the cannon. One shot. The Japanese plane comes apart in the air. Now here's what nobody tells you about that moment. The pilot who fired that shot, the man who just proved you could kill with a tank gun from a moving bomber, wrote in his report that same evening that the cannon was not worth the trouble. He wasn't complaining, he was warning. Because the United States Army had just spent millions of dollars building 463 of these aircraft, had pulled co-pilots out of cockpits to make room for a man whose only job was to hand-load 15-pound artillery shells in a space smaller than a telephone booth, while the plane shook, while the smoke filled the cockpit, while the target was coming up fast. The pilots who flew the B-25G into combat wanted it gone. And yet, for exactly 7 weeks in the summer of 1943, before the men who flew it finally won that argument, this unloved, unwanted, deeply uncomfortable machine did something nothing else in the American arsenal could do. It put a tank shell through the hull of a Japanese warship, point blank, from a moving aircraft at the height of a ship's mast. Stay with me, because the story of why the Army built a weapon its own pilots despised, and what Japan's commanders were filing in their reports during those 7 weeks, is one of the stranger chapters of the entire Pacific War. To understand why the B-25G existed at all, you have to go back to a problem that was killing American airmen long before anyone thought to put a tank gun on a bomber. The problem was simple. Hitting a moving ship from the air was nearly impossible. Not difficult, nearly impossible. In the early months of 1942, American bomber crews in the Pacific were flying B-25s at altitude, 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 feet, dropping bombs on Japanese convoy ships below. The math was brutal. A ship moving at 15 knots travels roughly 25 feet every second. By the time a bomb released from altitude reached the water, the ship had moved. The bomb missed. The crew turned around, flew home, and filed a report that said the same thing as the report from the day before. Near miss, no confirmed kills. The accuracy rate for high-altitude bombing against moving ships was running under 1%. 1%. The men flying those missions knew the numbers. They could feel it on every run, the long approach, the flak coming up, the bomb release, and then the column of water rising 30 yards off the target's bow. Japanese convoy commanders knew it too. They had learned early on that American bombers flying high were loud, visible, and largely harmless. The convoys kept moving, the supplies kept flowing, the troops kept arriving. Something had to change. In August 1942, General George Kenney took command of the 5th Air Force. Kenney was not a man who accepted inherited problems as permanent. He looked at the accuracy numbers, looked at the loss rates, and started asking a different kind of question. Not, how do we bomb ships better from altitude, but, what if we didn't bomb from altitude at all? The answer that came back was low-level attack. Fly in at mast height, release the bomb so close to the ship that it skips across the water like a flat stone and hits the hull directly. Skip bombing. It worked. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943 proved it could work devastatingly well. But skip bombing required the pilot to hold a straight line directly into the ship's anti-aircraft fire for several long, exposed seconds. The closer you got, the more effective the attack, and the more vulnerable the aircraft. Crews were dying on those runs, and even with skip bombing, there was a class of target the B-25 couldn't reliably kill in a single pass: destroyers. Heavily armed, fast-moving escort ships that protected the larger transports. A skip bomb that hit a destroyer amidships might punch through the hull. Might, but destroyers were built to absorb punishment. They didn't always go down on the first hit. And a second pass meant flying through every anti-aircraft gun on that ship a second time. What was needed was something with enough punch to guarantee a kill. One round, one pass. Done. The Army's solution was straightforward, in the way that only desperate solutions can be. Take the 75mm M4 cannon, the same gun mounted on the M4 Sherman tank, and fit it into the nose of a B-25. If you can't hit the ship with a bomb dropped from above, fly straight at it and shoot it like a tank. On paper, the logic was sound. The 75mm round could penetrate several inches of steel at combat ranges. One hit at the waterline of a transport ship meant one ship going down. North American Aviation got the contract. The co-pilot seat came out. A 9.5-foot cannon went in, running under the pilot's seat, muzzle pointing forward through the nose. 400 production aircraft ordered, 63 older B-25Cs converted, 463 B-25Gs in total. The Army was confident. The pilots, when they finally got into the cockpit and fired the thing, were considerably less so. Let's talk about what it actually felt like. Because the men who flew the B-25G didn't hate it because they were soft. They didn't hate it because they were afraid. They hated it because they were sitting inside it when it fired. Start with the gun itself. The M4 cannon was 9.5 feet long and weighed 900 pounds without ammunition. To fit it into the aircraft, engineers ran the barrel forward through the nose and seated the breech directly behind the pilot's left shoulder. When you sat in the cockpit of a B-25G, the back end of a tank cannon was 18 inches from your ear. The man responsible for loading that cannon was no longer the navigator. He was now called the cannoneer. Same person, different job description. His workspace was a narrow crawlway between the pilot's seat and the top turret gunner behind him. Each round weighed 15 pounds. The cannoneer picked it up, turned in a space that was never designed for turning, slid the round into the breech, locked it, and tapped the pilot on the shoulder. Ready. That was the signal. In a training environment on the ground, in good light, with the aircraft sitting still, that process took about 15 seconds. In combat, flying at mast height, 250 miles per hour, aircraft bucking in the prop wash of the plane ahead, target coming up fast through the windscreen. 15 seconds was a very long time, and that was just the loading. When the pilot pulled the trigger, the cannon fired with a recoil so violent that engineers had built a special cradle to absorb it. A rail system that let the gun slide backward 21 inches before stopping. 21 inches of controlled recoil. It wasn't enough. The aircraft shuddered on every shot. Not a vibration, a full-body shudder, the kind you feel in your teeth and your spine simultaneously. Airspeed dropped as much as 20 knots in the instant of firing. Pilots described the sensation as the aircraft hitting an invisible wall in mid-air. Rivets popped, not occasionally, routinely. Ground crews began finding loose fasteners after every mission that involved cannon fire. And then there was the smoke. The 75mm shell was a full artillery round, propellant, casing, projectile. When it fired, The combustion gases had nowhere to go except forward into the nose and backward into the cockpit. Within 2 or 3 shots, the cockpit filled with cordite smoke, thick enough to sting the eyes, sharp enough to taste on the back of your throat for hours afterward. Pilots flew the rest of their approach, runs half blind, eyes watering, trying to pick up the target through the haze. Now add one more problem. In practice, most crews managed 2 to 4 rounds in a single attack run. 2 to 4. Not because of ammunition. The aircraft carried 21 rounds, but because the approach window was short and the cannoneer could only load so fast. After those few shots, the target had passed beneath the aircraft, or the pilot had to pull off to avoid collision. Then the pilot had to climb, bank, and come around again for a second approach. During that turn, the aircraft was exposed. Speed was down. Altitude was minimal. Every anti-aircraft gun on every ship in the convoy had a clean look at a slow, low, predictable target. The men who survived those second passes were the ones who were lucky as much as skilled. One veteran who flew the G model in the Pacific described it this way in a post-war interview. He said flying the B-25G on a ship attack felt like walking up to a man with a knife, stopping 6 inches away to reload your pistol and hoping he didn't move while you did it. The pilots filed their reports, read them back to each other in the debrief tent, and started a conversation with their commanders that would last for the next 6 months. The conversation went like this. We want the cannon out. We want more .50 caliber machine guns instead. 8 of them, minimum. 10 if you can manage it. The commanders listened, nodded, told the pilots to keep flying the B-25G. There were still 463 of them to get through. Now let's cross the water, because while American pilots were filing complaints about smoke and recoil and loose rivets, the men on the receiving end were filing a very different kind of report, and their reports tell a story that the American side of the record doesn't fully capture. To understand what Japanese naval commanders were seeing, you have to understand how their ships were defended. Japanese convoy escorts in 1943 carried anti-aircraft guns designed around a specific threat model. High-altitude bombers, torpedo planes coming in low and level from the side, dive bombers dropping nearly vertical from above. Every gun position, every firing arc, every training drill was built around one of those 3 attack profiles. What those guns were not designed for was an aircraft coming in at the height of the ship's own mast, flying directly at the bow in a straight line at 250 miles per hour. The geometry was wrong for the defenders. A gun crew trained to track a dive bomber coming down at a steep angle had to completely reacquire an aircraft that was instead coming straight at them, hugging the water, closing the distance by roughly 370 feet every second. At that speed, from the moment a lookout spotted the B-25G at 2,000 yards out, the crew had less than 6 seconds before the aircraft was past them. 6 seconds to find the target, traverse the gun, establish a lead, and fire. Most crews couldn't do it. The ones who could were firing at an aircraft flying so low that the gun depression angles required were at or beyond the mechanical limits of their mounts. The guns simply couldn't point down far enough to track a target flying at mast height. This was not an accident on the American side. It was the entire logic of low-level attack. But the B-25G added something that mast height strafing alone didn't provide: range. A B-25G pilot could begin firing the cannon at 2,000 yards, more than a mile out. At that distance, the ship's crew was still trying to identify what type of aircraft they were looking at. They were not expecting an artillery shell. There was no visible bomb falling from above, no torpedo track in the water, no telltale splash pattern of a skip bomb run, just a flash from the aircraft's nose, a fraction of a second of silence. Then the round hit. The first time Japanese naval crews encountered this, they didn't know what had struck them. The entry hole was clean, no fire from above, no waterline explosion in the pattern of a torpedo. The damage was internal, where the round had traveled through the hull before losing energy. Early Japanese damage reports from these engagements described the hits as consistent with a new type of naval gun fired from a surface vessel, not an aircraft. They were looking for an American ship that wasn't there. It took several weeks, and the recovery of spent brass cartridges that American crews had initially been ordered to collect and bring back rather than eject over the target area, specifically to prevent Japanese intelligence from identifying the weapon before the picture became clearer. And even then, the response on the Japanese side revealed something important about how institutional thinking works in the middle of a war. The Japanese Navy's tactical doctrine had no category for what the B-25G was doing. Their framework divided air attacks into three types: bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes. An aircraft that flew at mast height and fired an artillery round didn't fit any of those categories cleanly. It wasn't a bomber in the doctrinal sense. It wasn't a torpedo plane. It was too slow and too large to be a fighter. The reports that came up through the chain of command used language that translated roughly as flying artillery, not a term of admiration, a term of confusion. Because flying artillery implied a weapon system that Japanese naval planners had never wargamed against, never trained their crews to counter, never built their convoy defense formations to address. Their response was to increase the number of escort destroyers and request more fighter cover. More destroyers, tighter formation, more guns pointing outward. It was a reasonable response to the threat model they understood. It was the wrong response to the threat model they were actually facing. More escort destroyers meant more targets for the cannon-armed B-25s and the skip-bombing aircraft flying alongside them. A tighter formation meant that when one ship was hit and slowed, the ships around it had less room to maneuver out of the attack corridor. The Japanese were solving for the weapon they thought they were facing. Meanwhile, the weapon they were actually facing was already being dismantled by the men who flew it. The B-25G arrived in the Southwest Pacific in July 1943. By mid-September, the crews had fired through virtually every 75-millimeter round in theater. 7 weeks, not 90 days, not a season. 7 weeks of combat operations before the ammunition supply ran dry, and the units shifted back to skip bombing while they waited for resupply. In those 7 weeks, the B-25G flew into combat over some of the most heavily defended shipping lanes in the Pacific Theater. And what happened was complicated. Not the clean story of a wonder weapon destroying everything in its path. Not the simple story of a failed experiment that never worked at all. Something more interesting than either. It started with Pappy Gunn. On that same July morning over Cape Gloucester, the mission we opened with, Gunn was flying Lil Fox, the first B-25 in theater fitted with the factory-installed 75-millimeter cannon. When the Japanese transport plane appeared, banking hard toward the airstrip, Gunn closed the distance and fired. The Japanese plane came apart. It was an aerial kill with an anti-ship cannon, something the weapon had never been designed to do, something no one in Washington had written into the specifications, something that existed precisely because Pappy Gunn was the kind of pilot who saw a target and pulled the trigger, regardless of what the manual said. The kill was confirmed. The report went up the chain, and for about 1 week, everyone involved was very enthusiastic about the B-25G. Then came the harder truth. In engagements against Japanese destroyers later that month, the cannon did exactly what its designers had promised. It penetrated. The rounds punched through outer hull plating at combat range, clean entry holes, confirmed hits. But destroyers are compartmentalized vessels built specifically to absorb that kind of damage and keep fighting. The hits damaged. They did not kill. The ships had to be finished off by skip bombs from other aircraft in the same formation. The after-action reports were blunt, effective against penetration, not reliable as a killing blow against warship-class targets. Against transports, however, unarmored cargo vessels and troop carriers, the picture was entirely different. A single 75-millimeter round entering the hull of a fully loaded transport at the waterline could produce catastrophic flooding. These were thin-skinned vessels carrying fuel, ammunition, and men. One well-placed round in the right compartment was enough. The B-25G crews learned to sort their targets. Destroyers got skip bombs. Transports got the cannon. It wasn't the doctrine anyone had written. It was the doctrine the war produced. Through August 1943, the B-25Gs flew as part of coordinated multi-aircraft attacks on Japanese convoy routes, running from Rabaul down the coast of New Guinea. The standard attack formation, by this point, had evolved into something precise and brutal. RAAF Beaufighters came in first, at extreme low level, strafing the deck gun crews on escort ships to suppress return fire before the main attack. Then the B-25s, a mix of cannon-armed G models and skip-bombing D models, came in directly behind, splitting between the escort destroyers and the transports. The cannon aircraft lined up on the transports, opened fire at 2,000 yards, used 50 caliber tracers to walk the aim point in, then triggered the cannon when the tracer stream was walking up the hull. The skip bombers went for the destroyers. It worked, not perfectly, not every time, but well enough that Japanese convoy commanders began reporting to Rabaul that the standard defensive formation was inadequate for the attack pattern they were facing. The convoys began requesting additional fighter cover, then more fighter cover, then fighter cover at specific altitudes to address the low-level threat. Japanese Zero fighters assigned convoy escort duty found the mast height attack profile nearly as difficult to intercept as the gun crews found it to defend against. A Zero diving on a B-25 flying at 50 feet had almost no pull-out margin. Pilots who committed to the intercept angle risked flying into the water. Pilots who held off gave the B-25 time to complete its run and escape. The P-38 Lightnings flying top cover kept the Zeros occupied at altitude. Below them, the B-25Gs went about their work. The single most concentrated demonstration of what the cannon could actually do came not against warships at all, but against Japanese coastal barge traffic. Japan's supply system in New Guinea relied heavily on small motorized barges, wooden-hulled vessels carrying troops and supplies along the coastline at night, sheltering in coves and river mouths during daylight. They were small, numerous, and difficult for larger bombers to find. They represented a significant portion of Japanese logistical capacity in the theater. Against barges, the 75-millimeter cannon was devastating in the way its designers had always promised. One round into a wooden-hulled barge carrying ammunition produced results that needed no after-action report to describe. Crews began actively hunting barge traffic because the cannon performed there exactly as the original specifications had claimed. One shot, one kill, no second pass required. The barge routes along the New Guinea coastline became genuinely dangerous for Japanese resupply operations in a way they had not been before. Not because of skip bombing, not because of high-altitude attack, but because of a tank gun bolted into the nose of a medium bomber flown by men who had learned, through 7 weeks of hard combat, exactly what it could and could not do. By mid-September 1943, the 75mm ammunition stocks in theater were effectively exhausted. The B-25Gs kept flying, but they were flying now as skip bombers, the cannon silent, the cannoneer sitting in his crawlway with nothing to load. The crews didn't complain about that. They filed their requests again, formally this time, through channels. We want the cannon out. We want more 50s. 8 minimum. The requests landed on General Kenny's desk, and this time he read them differently than he had 6 months before. George Kenny was not a general who ignored the men doing the fighting. That was precisely what made him effective, and precisely what made him dangerous to anyone who brought him a weapons system that looked better on paper than it performed in combat. By the fall of 1943, Kenny had 2 things on his desk that he hadn't had 6 months earlier. He had the combat record of the B-25G, and he had the written opinions of the men who had flown it. The combat record was mixed, effective against barges and transports, unreliable against destroyers, limited by a firing rate that required multiple passes against hardened targets, dependent on a cannoneer working in conditions that were genuinely hazardous even by the standards of Pacific combat. The pilot opinions were not mixed. They were unanimous. One group commander's report, typical of the assessments coming up through the chain, put it in language that left no room for interpretation. Unless the 75mm cannon was flanked by a minimum of 6 and preferably 8 50 caliber machine guns, the installation was not worthwhile. He wasn't enthusiastic about the cannon. He would rather have the same weight in 50 caliber machine guns. They threw more metal in a single run, and his crews had had little trouble beating down the deck fire of anything they attacked, up to and including Japanese light cruisers, with mast machine gun fire alone. That report didn't come from a pilot who was afraid of the cannon. It came from a pilot who had done the arithmetic. 15 pounds per cannon round, 21 rounds carried. Total weight, 315 pounds of 75mm ammunition. Replace that with 50 caliber ammunition and additional gun mounts. You could put 8 forward-firing machine guns in the same nose space and carry enough rounds to sustain fire for the entire length of an attack run. 8 guns firing simultaneously, each at 850 rounds per minute, each round traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. That was a wall of metal that swept a ship's deck clean before the aircraft ever reached release point. The cannon gave you 2 to 4 shots per pass and a cockpit full of smoke. The machine guns gave you continuous suppression, better accuracy at mast height, and a crew that could still see when the target came into range. The math was not complicated. Kenny approved the transition, not immediately, not cleanly. The Army had already paid for 463 B-25Gs and wasn't prepared to write that off without an argument. But the argument had already been settled in the skies over New Guinea. In the field, units didn't wait for official authorization. Crew chiefs and mechanics, the same kind of men who had modified B-25s into strafers in the first place, began pulling cannons out of G models on their own authority. No paperwork, no formal request up the chain. They unbolted the cannon, crated it, and retrofitted the nose with additional 50 caliber mounts, using whatever hardware was available in theater. When their commanders found out, most of them looked at the modification, looked at the combat results, and quietly approved what had already been done. The formal solution came from North American Aviation. The B-25H lighter cannon, the T-13E1, designed specifically for aircraft use. Less recoil, less weight. 4 nose-mounted 50 caliber machine guns flanking it on both sides, additional gun blisters on the fuselage. Dorsal turret moved forward. 1,000 were built, and quietly without ceremony, without any official acknowledgement that the men on the ground had been right and the procurement system had been wrong. The B-25G was retired from frontline service. The cannons came out. The machine guns went in. The smoke cleared from the cockpits for the last time. The pilots got what they wanted. It had only taken 7 weeks of combat, 6 months of reports, and 463 aircraft for the Army to agree with them. Here is the final irony of the B-25G. The Japanese never solved it while it was still a problem, and by the time they understood what had been hitting their ships, the Americans had already taken it apart. Sometime in late 1943, Japanese forces recovered a downed B-25G in the Southwest Pacific. The aircraft had gone down largely intact. Enough remained to allow a careful inspection by Japanese technical intelligence personnel. What they found in the nose stopped them. Not machine guns, not a bomb sight, not any of the equipment they expected to find in an American medium bomber. A cannon, a full artillery piece, running from the nose of the aircraft back beneath the pilot's seat. The inspection report that followed used language that translated as something close to flying artillery, a term that appeared in several Japanese technical documents from this period, not as a compliment, as a classification problem, because the Japanese military framework for understanding enemy air threats had 3 categories: bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes. What they were looking at fit none of those categories cleanly. It was a bomber-sized aircraft carrying a direct-fire artillery weapon designed for surface engagements. The closest equivalent in Japanese doctrine was a naval gun mounted on a warship. They had no counter-doctrine for it, no tactical manual entry, no established defensive formation specifically designed to defeat an aircraft that engaged at 2,000 yards with a direct-fire artillery round. Their response, as it had been from the beginning, was to add more escort destroyers and request more fighter cover, both of which were, by this point, answers to a question that had already changed, because by the time Japanese intelligence had processed what they found in that wreckage, filed the report, moved it up the chain, and begun discussing what a defensive counter might look like. The B-25G was already gone. The cannons had been pulled. The machine guns had gone in. The aircraft that had produced all those damage reports and all that doctrinal confusion no longer existed in the form that had caused the confusion. Japan had spent months trying to understand a weapon that the Americans had already decided wasn't worth keeping. There is something almost absurd about that. An entire intelligence process, recovered wreckage, technical inspection, damage report analysis, convoy debrief interviews, all of it directed at a system that its own operators had been trying to get rid of since the first week they flew it. The pilots who hated the B-25G won their argument before Japan even understood what the argument was about, and that is the story of the B-25G. Not a wonder weapon, not a failure, something stranger than either. A weapon genuinely feared by the enemy it was used against, described in their reports as something new, something without a name in their doctrine, something that required a response they never finished building, while simultaneously being despised by every man who flew it and formally retired before the war was half over. The Army built 463 of them, flew them for 7 weeks of serious combat, pulled the cannons out, replaced them with machine guns, and moved on. Japan filed reports about flying artillery for months afterward. The flying artillery was already in a crate somewhere in Australia. That's the Pacific War, not clean victories and clear lessons. Complicated machines, exhausted men, and decisions made at 30 feet above the water that the people writing the manuals were still trying to catch up with long after the shooting stopped. If you've stayed with this story to the end, thank you. Hit the subscribe button if you want more. And if you have a family member who flew B-25s in the Pacific, drop their name in the comments below. They deserve to be remembered. February 20th, 1942. 5 o'clock in the afternoon. 8 Japanese bombers are locked in tight V formation, 11,000 feet over the South Pacific. 9 miles from the American carrier. No fighter opposition in sight. The lead bombardier has the Lexington in his crosshairs. He has flown this kind of run before, over the Philippines, over Malaya. He knows what happens next. Then the plane on the far right of the formation erupts in flame. Nobody in the formation sees where it came from. The entire fighter squadron had been pulled away, chasing the first wave, refueling out of position. 2 Wildcats were left to guard the ship. Then the guns on the second one jammed on the very first firing pass. 1 plane, 8 bombers, 34 seconds of ammunition. 4 minutes later, 5 of those bombers were sinking into the Pacific. The Japanese filed their after-action report. They listed the cause, intercepted by an undetermined number of American fighters. They never knew it was one man. Not during the battle, not after the war, not ever. This is the story of Butch O'Hare, and of the enemies who never learned his name. Butch O'Hare did what he did with nobody watching. No cameras, no witnesses close enough to see. Just the gun camera film bolted to his Wildcat, and even he didn't know what it had captured until he landed back on the ship. A lot of men fought like that. Nobody watching. No gun camera, no Medal of Honor, just a family, and a memory that fades a little more with every passing year. If one of those men was someone in your family, leave their name in the comments below. Don't let their story disappear. When Jimmy Thatch took command of Fighting Squadron 3 in 1940, he had a test for every new pilot who walked through the door. He called it the humiliation team. It was exactly what it sounds like. Thatch, his executive officer Lovelace, Gaylor, and his gunnery officer Rollo Lemon, the 4 best combat pilots in the squadron, would take each newcomer up one at a time, give them every advantage, altitude, first move, their choice of angle. Then see how long it took before the new man had a gun sight pointed at their tail. The answer, without exception, was not long at all. Thatch had been running this test for years. It wasn't cruelty, it was instruction. A pilot who just earned his wings was usually, in Thatch's words, a little full of himself. The humiliation team took care of that. You got above a man with a better plane, you owned him. That was the lesson. That's what the new men needed to understand before they flew against the Japanese. Then Butch O'Hare showed up. Thatch took him up first. Did everything he knew, broke left, broke right, reversed, pulled hard into a turn. Nothing worked. O'Hare stayed on him through every move and never made a mistake. When they landed, Thatch went straight to Lemon. I want every man on the humiliation team to go up with this kid. He's pretty good, and I'll wager he gets on your tail the first time and stays there. They never do, Lemon said. I know, Thatch said. Where is he? Lemon went up. O'Hare did it again. Every member of the team went up. Same result, every time. Thatch said afterward, the first time I took him up, he didn't make any mistakes. I did everything I could to fool him and shake him, and he came right in on me and stuck there. He could have shot me right out of the air. What Thatch didn't know, what nobody in the squadron knew, was where that sense of timing had come from. Butch O'Hare grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. Summers at river camps on the Merrimack and the Gasconade. His father, Edward J. O'Hare, everybody called him Easy Eddie, was a man who did nothing half-heartedly. When Butch was a boy and his father caught him sprawled on the couch eating sweet rolls, he enrolled him in military school the following week. At those river camps, Easy Eddie would take a tin can, hold it out over the current, and drop it. Then he'd hand his son a .22 rifle. "Don't shoot where it is," he told him. "Shoot where it's going to be." Easy Eddie O'Hare was Al Capone's lawyer. More than his lawyer, his business partner, the man who kept the Chicago outfit's dog racing operations running clean and profitable. He made a fortune. He lived in a mansion in Holly Hills with a swimming pool and a skating rink. His biggest client was the most feared gangster in America. Then, in 1930, Easy Eddie walked into a meeting with a reporter from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and asked to be connected to the Internal Revenue Service. He gave the federal government everything they needed to put Capone away on tax evasion. He tipped them that Capone had fixed the jury pool. He helped break the code on the bookkeeper's ledgers. The IRS agent who ran the investigation called Eddie O'Hare one of the best undercover men he had ever known. The case that sent Al Capone to Alcatraz ran through Easy Eddie O'Hare. Nobody agreed on why he did it. Some said conscience. Some said he wanted a clean name for his son's Naval Academy application. Some said he could see Capone was finished anyway and wanted to be on the right side of the outcome. Easy Eddie was a lawyer. He understood how things ended. On November 8, 1939, 1 week before Capone was released from Alcatraz, Easy Eddie left Sportsman's Park Racetrack in Cicero and drove home. Someone pulled alongside his Lincoln Zephyr on Ogden Avenue and opened fire with a shotgun. He never made it off the block. That afternoon, his son was at Naval Air Station Pensacola, in the middle of flight training. Butch had not yet earned his wings. That would come the following May. He landed at sunset and heard the news. He applied for emergency leave, flew home for the funeral, and reported back to Pensacola. No one recorded what he said about it. Thatch watched O'Hare closely for the next year and arrived at a conclusion he rarely stated out loud about a pilot. The kid had a sense of timing and relative motion that couldn't be taught. He picked up aerial gunnery faster than anyone Thatch had ever seen, and he didn't try to muscle the airplane. He flew it. In 1941, Thatch was working a problem that kept him up at night. Intelligence reports out of China described the Japanese Zero in terms that made everything the Navy was flying look obsolete. Faster, more maneuverable, better rate of climb. If the reports were accurate, the F-4F Wildcat was in serious trouble every time it met one. Thatch started working on a solution at his kitchen table in Coronado, California. Matchsticks arranged on the tablecloth, running through scenarios until something clicked. A two-plane weave, each fighter covering the other's blind spot, turning toward each other when a threat appeared so that an attacker following one plane would fly directly into the gun sight of the other. He called it the beam defense position. Everyone else would eventually call it the Thatch weave. To test it properly, he needed someone to attack him. He picked O'Hare. O'Hare led 4 Wildcats as the attacking force and tried every angle he could find. Every time he set up what should have been a clear shot, one of Thatch's planes had a nose pointed back at him. He landed and walked over to Thatch. "Skipper, it really worked. I couldn't make any attack without seeing the nose of one of your airplanes pointed at me." On February 20th, 1942, both men were over the Lexington when the Japanese attack came. Thatch was sent after the first wave. O'Hare was held in reserve with his wingman, Marion Dufilio. Radar picked up the second wave, 8 Bettys approaching from the east, 12 miles out. Thatch was too far away. O'Hare and Dufilho were the only ones in position. Thatch was still working his way back when he looked up and counted 3 planes burning in the sky at the same time. There was no one else out there, only Butch. O'Hare and Dufilio climbed hard, positioning themselves 1,500 feet above the Betty formation, slightly behind and to the right. The bombers were in a tight V, their bomb run nearly locked in on the Lexington below. Dufilo opened fire. His guns jammed on the first burst. He kept flying anyway, holding position, angling to draw some of the defensive fire to give O'Hare whatever cover was possible without working guns. It was everything he had left to offer. O'Hare was alone. He came in from the right side of the formation, diving at a steep angle, and put his fire into the engines. Not the fuselage, not the wings. The engines. He'd been taught to lead a moving target since he was a boy on the Merrimack River, and he didn't waste a round. The first Betty fell away trailing smoke. He swung around and took a second before the formation could react. Then he crossed to the left side and hit a third. He drove back in and targeted the fourth. Each pass lasted seconds. He had roughly 34 seconds of total firing time spread across the entire engagement. On the third pass, he drove at the lead plane, the commander's aircraft. He put a burst directly into the port engine. The engine didn't catch fire. It tore free of the wing entirely. The explosion was so violent that the other Japanese pilots assumed it must have been an anti-aircraft shell from the ships below. Not one of them believed a single fighter was responsible. O'Hare's ammunition ran out. He kept going. He drove the empty Wildcat directly into the formation, close enough to try to clip wings, to damage anything he could reach. The surviving Bettys broke off their bomb run and scattered. The Lexington maneuvered hard, and the few bombs that released missed clean. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes. O'Hare brought the Wildcat back to the Lexington. As he came in on final approach with his landing gear down, a nervous anti-aircraft gunner on the catwalk opened up on him. One round punched through the port wing and knocked out his airspeed indicator, the only bullet that hit his plane all day. He landed, climbed out of the cockpit, and walked back along the flight deck to where the gunner was standing. He looked down at the young sailor. "Son, if you don't stop shooting at me when I've got my wheels down, I'm going to have to report you to the gunnery officer." That was all he said. Later, someone asked him about it. He said he didn't really mind getting shot at when the wheels were up, but it might force a wave-off on approach, and he didn't like to take wave-offs. Thatch worked out the math afterward. 60 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition per bomber destroyed. He said later he couldn't decide which was more remarkable, the courage or the aim. O'Hare told Captain Sherman he didn't want the Medal of Honor. Any one of the pilots in the squadron would have done the same thing. Sherman recommended him anyway. Franklin Roosevelt read the recommendation, and in April 1942, he called O'Hare to the White House. The men who flew those 8 Bettys on February 20th were not rookies. The 4th Kokutai had just transferred to Rabaul, fresh from one of the most astonishing runs in naval aviation history. In December 1941, this same unit, these same experienced crews, had flown 400 miles off the coast of Indochina, found the British Royal Navy's Force Zede in open ocean, and sunk HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse in under 2 hours. No fighter escort had stopped them. No British aircraft arrived in time to intervene. 2 of the most powerful warships afloat went to the bottom. It was the first time in history that capital ships underway at sea had been sunk by air attack alone, with no assistance from surface ships or submarines. Before that, they had flown over the Philippines and Malaya. They had made long-range strikes at altitudes and distances that weren't supposed to be possible. The Betty bomber was the weapon Yamamoto had built his entire Pacific strategy around, a land-based aircraft that could reach out across open ocean and strike naval targets without needing a carrier to launch from. On February 20th, the 4th Kokutai's torpedo supply hadn't arrived at Rabaul yet. They were flying with bombs instead. 400 miles out to sea, no fighter escort, no particular reason to expect serious opposition. They had done this kind of run before, multiple times, against targets that were supposed to be defended. Lieutenant Commander Takuzo Ito led the second wave personally. 8 planes, tight formation, textbook approach. The after-action report filed by the 4th Kokutai described what happened to the second wave in a single line. Intercepted by an undetermined number of American fighters. 15 of 17 bombers failed to return. 15 out of 17. The surviving crews could not explain what had happened. The V formation had come apart according to a logic they couldn't reconstruct. The fire had come from unexpected angles. Planes had gone down one after another in a sequence that didn't match any attack pattern they had encountered before. Several pilots, seeing the explosion that took out Ito's aircraft, assumed it had been anti-aircraft fire from the ships below, a direct shell strike. It seemed the only explanation for the scale of the damage. The most basic fact, that a single Wildcat flown by one pilot with a jammed wingman had done most of this, was not visible to anyone inside a burning aircraft and could not be reconstructed by the surviving crews from fragments of what they had glimpsed in 4 minutes before their formation broke apart. There was no American name in that report, no pilot identified, just a unit designation that had been gutted, experienced aircrew who had trained for years, who had been over China and the Philippines and Malaya, gone. Irreplaceable in any short time frame. The Japanese invasion of Lae and Salamaua in New Guinea, planned for the first days of March 1942, had to be postponed. The 4th Kokutai no longer had the strength to provide air cover for an amphibious operation of that scale. The Allied forces defending New Guinea got more time to dig in. The delay had consequences that rippled through the entire Pacific campaign in the months that followed. The officer who signed the postponement order didn't know the name of the man who made it necessary. That name does not appear in any Japanese document from that day or from any day after. In the spring of 1942, a young ensign named Alex Vraciu was sitting in an auditorium at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, waiting to hear a Medal of Honor recipient speak. Butch O'Hare had been pulled off flight duty and sent on a war bond tour. The country needed a face to put on what was happening in the Pacific. Wake Island had fallen on December 23rd, Hong Kong on Christmas Day, Singapore in February. Bataan was about to go. Here was a living American ace who had saved an aircraft carrier alone. Roosevelt put the Medal of Honor around his neck in April 1942, with O'Hare's wife, Rita, placing the ribbon while the president watched. By May, O'Hare was standing in front of rooms full of young men who wanted to fly fighters. Vraciu walked out of that auditorium and decided he wanted to fly for that man specifically. A coin flip in his orders eventually assigned him to VF-3, under O'Hare's command. In March 1943, he reported in, he would spend the next 5 months flying on O'Hare's wing. O'Hare was not what Vraciu had expected. Edward Stafford, who wrote the official history of the Enterprise, was direct about it. O'Hare was unchallengeably the best shot and the best pilot in his command. But what Vraciu would remember most wasn't the flying. It was the way O'Hare taught, mostly by saying almost nothing. During one training dogfight over Maui, Vraciu pushed close to a mid-air collision, trying to keep O'Hare from getting on his tail. He thought the aggression would impress his commanding officer. O'Hare landed, walked over, and said 5 words. Save it for the Japanese. That was the whole lesson. Don't burn yourself up proving something in practice. The real fight was coming. Save it. In October 1943, flying from the light carrier Independence off Wake Island, O'Hare and Vraciu went up together against a Japanese fighter formation. O'Hare spotted 3 Zeros and attacked immediately. flaming the lead plane. Vraciu got the wingman. It was Vraciu's first aerial kill. He said afterward it felt good, like the beginning of something. By late November, O'Hare had transferred to the Enterprise as Air Group Commander, and Vraciu was flying with a different unit covering the Tarawa landings. When the news came through, O'Hare had gone down on a night mission, no body, no wreckage. Vraciu found his wingman Willie Callan. He told Callan he was going to shoot down 10 Betty bombers, one for every man who deserved to see what came next. He said later, "Between the vow on Butch and Pearl Harbor, I think that probably was the biggest single motivator, the driving force, in my life as to why I preferred to be out there rather than back home." Within 3 months, Vraciu was the top Navy ace in the Pacific. By June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, he shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes. Before every attack run, he checked his 6 o'clock, the way O'Hare had taught him. 21 months after the Lexington, O'Hare was commanding Air Group 6 aboard the USS Enterprise off the Gilbert Islands. The Marines were fighting and dying on Tarawa, and every night Japanese Betty bombers were coming in low with torpedoes, probing the task force in the darkness. Nobody had figured out how to stop them. Radar on the ships could track the incoming planes, but couldn't give a night fighter precise enough guidance to intercept in total darkness. A single pilot in a black sky, with no visual references and guidance that lagged behind the target, was effectively blind. The Bettys came in at low altitude, dropped their torpedoes, and disappeared back into the night before anyone could respond. O'Hare had an idea. Pair a radar-equipped Avenger torpedo bomber with 2 Hellcat fighters. The Avenger's radar operator tracks the enemy and talks the fighters into attack position. 3 planes working as a single system, the Avenger's eyes, the Hellcat's guns. Nobody had done this from a carrier before, at night, against an actual attack. O'Hare worked out the procedures, ran the concept past his admiral, and requested permission to fly the first mission himself. He also visited the newly captured airfield on Tarawa that day to inspect it as a possible emergency landing site. The field was still pitted with bomb craters. He decided the carrier deck was safer, even in the dark. The call to man planes came while O'Hare was eating dinner. He picked up what was left of his meal, held it in his fist as he walked, and headed for the ready room dressed in loose Marine Corps coveralls. 3 planes launched into the gathering dark. O'Hare in Hellcat number double. Oh! The Air Group Commander's aircraft, marked with white 00s on the fuselage. Ensign Warren Scon on his wing. Lieutenant Commander John Phillips in the radar-equipped Avenger, with Lieutenant Hazen Rand on the radar set and gunner Alvin Kernan in the turret. Before they launched, O'Hare told Phillips he wasn't sure they'd make it back to the carrier in the dark. They might have to try for Tarawa instead. "We'll be lucky if we even find the damned place," he said. The Avenger's radar found the incoming Japanese bombers. Phillips maneuvered the formation and shot down 2 Bettys using the Avenger's forward guns, something that surprised everyone, including Phillips. The night intercept was working exactly as O'Hare had designed it. To regroup in total darkness after the engagement, the 3 planes had to turn on their running lights. There was no other option. Without lights, the Hellcats and the Avenger couldn't locate each other, and in the dark, at low altitude, over open ocean, a mid-air collision was as likely as enemy fire. The lights were a risk O'Hare had accounted for before they launched. It was built into the plan. A Japanese Betty was drifting nearby, separated from its formation, its crew searching the darkness for the American fleet. The pilot saw 3 sets of running lights moving together. He moved toward them. The nose gunner opened fire on the nearest Hellcat. Kernan, in the Avenger turret, fired back at the Betty. The Betty disappeared into the dark. At 7:34 p.m., Scon watched Hellcat number 00 roll left, nose over, and go straight down. He called O'Hare on the radio. No response. He followed the plane down to 300 feet above the water before he had to pull out to avoid the ocean. The search that night found nothing. The search the following morning found nothing. Butch O'Hare went into the Pacific 26 miles northwest of the Enterprise and was never recovered. To this day, no one can say with certainty what killed him. Kernan's return fire at the Betty happened in the same seconds that O'Hare went down. His rounds could have struck the Hellcat. The Betty's nose gunner had also fired directly at it. The original Enterprise action report concluded only that the cause of O'Hare's disappearance could not be definitely determined. Ewing and Lundstrom, who wrote the most thorough biography of O'Hare and interviewed every surviving participant, concluded it was the Betty's nose gunner, a lucky burst that likely entered the cockpit from above on the port side, ahead of the armor plate. Other historians lean toward friendly fire. The wreckage has never been found. The question has never been closed. What is certain? The crew of that Japanese Betty had no idea who they had fired at. They filed their report, and Butch O'Hare's name did not appear in it. Just as in February 1942, the Japanese documented what happened that night without knowing the name of the American on the other end of it. In September 1949, the city of Chicago renamed its airport after a naval aviator from St. Louis who had never lived there. The old airport code stayed, ORD, from Orchard Field, the military airfield the airport had been built on. Nobody changed it. You still see it on every boarding pass headed to Chicago. Today, more than 900,000 people pass through O'Hare International on an average day. They hear the name over the PA system. They see it on the sign above the gates as they walk to their flights. Butch O'Hare has no grave, no marker, no coordinates on any chart. Just a point in the Pacific, 26 miles northwest of where the Enterprise was running on the night of November 26, 1943, where Hellcat number 00 went down at 7:34 p.m. and was never found. Butch O'Hare has no grave, no place to leave flowers, only a set of coordinates in the Pacific, where Hellcat number 00 went down at 7:34 p.m. and was never found. But every day, more than 900,000 people walk through the airport that carries his name, and most of them have never heard of him. If you know, share this with someone who doesn't. That's all he needs. 7:38 in the morning, April 18th, 1942. The USS Hornet is pitching hard in the North Pacific. 20-foot swells, rain slashing sideways across the flight deck. Jimmy Doolittle sits in the cockpit of his B-25. He looks out at the runway in front of him. 467 feet of wet steel deck. That is all the runway he has. And at the end of it, nothing, just gray ocean and a 60-foot drop. He already knows what the fuel gauges will say when this is over. Not enough to get back. There is no ship waiting for him on the other side of Japan. No rescue plan, no extraction route. Washington had given these 80 men an assignment and quietly decided not to plan for their return. Doolittle knew that before he ever stepped foot on this carrier. He got in the cockpit anyway. 2 hours later, smoke was rising over Tokyo, and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the most powerful naval commander in the Pacific, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor, the man who had delivered Japan's greatest military triumph, walked into his private cabin aboard the battleship Yamato, closed the door, and handed command to his chief of staff. His chief of staff opened his diary that evening and wrote 7 words. Today, The victory belongs to the enemy. Not because Tokyo was burning, but because no one in the Imperial Japanese High Command, not one admiral, not one general, not one intelligence officer, could answer a single question. Where did those 16 planes come from? That question, that one unanswered question, would trigger a chain of decisions that ended Japan's power in the Pacific for the rest of the war, and the man who started it all was sitting in a muddy field in China that night, certain he was going to face a military tribunal. Before we go any further, the youngest World War II veterans alive today are in their late 90s. Most are gone, and when they go, the stories go with them. Not the history book version, the real stories, the ones they told at the dinner table, the ones they never told anyone. If your father served in this war, if your grandfather wore that uniform, write his name in the comments. Write where he served, what he did, what you remember him saying. Even one sentence keeps that story alive. These men deserve more than a name on a monument. They deserve to be remembered as people, so do that for them. Right now, before the video ends. In the spring of 1942, Japan had been at war for exactly 4 months. In those 4 months, they had seized Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and Wake Island. They had pushed the British Navy out of the Indian Ocean. They had sunk or disabled most of the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. And through all of it, through every advance, every victory, every island falling, not a single enemy bomb had landed on Japanese soil. Not one. The Japanese military did not consider this luck. They considered it math. Their strategists had done the calculations carefully, methodically, the way serious military planners do. They looked at every American bomber in service. They measured the range of each one. They marked the nearest American base on the map. The nearest base capable of launching a bombing raid was Midway Island, 2,000 miles from Tokyo. The longest-range American bomber available in early 1942 could fly roughly 1,500 miles with a combat load. 1,500 miles. 2,000 miles. The numbers did not add up. They could not add up. Japan was safe. Not because their enemies lacked the courage to attack, but because their enemies lacked the aircraft to reach them. This was not arrogance. This was arithmetic. And so Japan built its defenses accordingly. Their anti-aircraft batteries around Tokyo were well-maintained, well-staffed, and trained to shoot down exactly what they expected to see. Carrier-based fighters and dive bombers, small, fast aircraft. Nobody trained them to shoot at a twin-engine, medium-range Army bomber flying at 200 feet off the ground. Nobody trained them because nobody imagined such a thing was possible. The civilian population of Tokyo had no air raid shelters, no evacuation routes, no practice drills. Why would they need any of that? The ocean itself was their protection. 12,000 miles of it, stretching between Japan and the American coast. In the spring of 1942, there was not a man or woman in Tokyo who went to bed at night afraid of American bombs. There was, however, one man in Japan's military who worried. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the most respected naval mind in Japan. Yamamoto had spent time in the United States. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew Americans in a way most Japanese officers did not, and something about their silence bothered him. After Pearl Harbor, after all those losses, the Americans had gone quiet. No major naval strike, no retaliation of any kind. He wrote about his unease in letters to close friends. He told them the people celebrating Japan's safety were wrong. Their confidence was not something Japan had earned. It was something the Americans had not yet chosen to take away. He raised his concerns formally with the Naval General Staff. He suggested that an American carrier task force might attempt to strike the home islands directly. The General Staff reviewed the same calculations every other Japanese strategist had reviewed: the ranges, the distances, the aircraft types. Their conclusion was the same as everyone else's: impossible. Yamamoto did not argue further. He had made his case. They had rendered their judgment. He let the matter drop. On the morning of April 18, 1942, the cherry blossoms were in full bloom in Tokyo. It was a Saturday. Families were out walking. Children were flying kites in the parks. Vendors were selling food along the riverbanks. The city was alive with the particular kind of ease that comes from winning a war and knowing you are untouchable. High above the streets, a formation of low-flying aircraft approached from the east. People on the rooftops looked up and waved. They assumed, naturally, that the planes were Japanese. Nobody had told them to assume anything else. There was no reason to. The planes flew on, and in 40 minutes, everything Japan believed about itself would be wrong. Before we talk about what happened over Tokyo, you need to understand who Jimmy Doolittle actually was, because the version of this story most people know treats him like a symbol, a hero, a name on a plaque. But symbols don't sweat through a cockpit above the Pacific. Symbols don't lie awake at night doing math on a fuel calculation that keeps coming up short. Men do. James Harold Doolittle was not a career soldier. He had not come up through West Point. He had not spent his 20s climbing the peacetime ranks. He was a stunt pilot, a daredevil, a man who in the 1920s and 30s made his reputation by flying faster and lower and closer to the ground than anyone believed was survivable. In 1929, he became the first pilot in history to take off, fly a full course, and land entirely on instruments, with a canvas hood over his cockpit, so he could not see anything outside. He also had a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. So, when people looked at Doolittle, they saw a showman. What they missed was the engineer underneath, a man who understood precisely and technically exactly what an aircraft could and could not do. And in the winter of 1942, that combination, the daring and the precision, was exactly what this mission required. The idea had started with a Navy captain named Francis Lowe. Lowe had been watching Army twin-engine bombers making practice runs over a runway painted to look like a carrier deck. He had a thought. If those planes could simulate taking off from a carrier, could they actually do it? It had never been done. Not once in the history of aviation. A medium bomber needs at least 1,500 feet of runway to get airborne. An aircraft carrier deck is less than 500. The physics said no. But Lowe took the idea to Admiral King anyway, and King took it to General Arnold, and Arnold called one man, Jimmy Doolittle. Doolittle worked the problem the way an engineer works a problem. Strip the aircraft down. Remove every pound that isn't essential. The belly gun turret came out. The liaison radio came out. The bomb sight was replaced with a simple 20-cent metal sight that one of his men had designed in a hotel room. Extra fuel tanks were installed in the bomb bay and in the cabin itself. Not proper tanks, rubber bladders, tin cans strapped to the floor with rubber tubing running to the engines. 80 men would fly across the Pacific Ocean with improvised fuel tanks sitting open in their cabins, leaking fumes the entire way. One spark, one static discharge, one cigarette lit by a nervous gunner. That was all it would take. Doolittle knew this. He approved it anyway, because there was no other way. He trained his crews for 6 weeks at Eglin Field in Florida. Short field takeoffs, low-altitude flying, navigation over open water. He told them almost nothing about where they were going. Most of them figured it out. Japan was the only target that made sense. What they did not figure out, what Doolittle chose not to tell them directly, was the fuel calculation. The original plan had called for launching 400 miles from Japan. At that distance, with careful throttle management, the B-25s could reach the Chinese coast, just barely, with almost nothing left in the tanks. But on the morning of April 18th, a Japanese patrol boat spotted the task force 650 miles out, 12 hours early, 250 miles too far. Doolittle had a choice: turn back or launch. He stood on the flight deck of the Hornet in the rain, looked at his men standing by their aircraft, and gave the order to launch. He did not call a meeting. He did not explain the new fuel numbers to all 80 crews. He already knew what the math said. He had been carrying that math alone since the night before. Some of those planes would not have enough fuel to reach the airfields in China. That was now a certainty. He kept that to himself, and he walked to his aircraft. Doolittle was the first to go. 467 feet of pitching, rain-soaked deck, a 60-foot drop to the ocean if he didn't pull it off, and a B-25 loaded so heavy with fuel that the engineers back home had said the takeoff was borderline impossible. The deck officer swung his flag. Doolittle pushed the throttles to full. The plane shook. The engines screamed. He ran the length of the deck in seconds. The bow dropped into a trough between two swells, and for one moment the plane was pointed not at the sky but directly at the ocean. Then the bow came back up, and Doolittle flew. The men watching from the deck let out a sound that one of them later described as half cheer, half prayer. 15 more planes still had to follow him. Inside each cockpit, as the Hornet disappeared behind them, the crews settled into the long flight west. The cabin smelled of aviation fuel. The rubber bladder tanks sweated fumes into the enclosed space. Crews were ordered not to smoke, not to use the radio, not to make any electronic transmission that might give away their position. 5 men in a metal tube, flying low over open ocean, toward a country that did not know they were coming. And not one of them knew with certainty whether they had enough fuel to land on the other side. Doolittle knew. He was doing the math in his head the whole way. The extra distance, the fuel burn at low altitude versus the planned cruise altitude, the headwind they had fought getting off the deck. He had committed to this. Not just to the mission, but to being the man who absorbed the weight of what the mission actually was, so the men behind him could focus on flying. That was his job now, not the stunt pilot, not the record setter, not the MIT engineer. Just a man in a cockpit 200 feet above the Pacific, doing math no one else needed to know about, and flying west. Shortly after noon on April 18, 1942, Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 crossed the Japanese coastline. He was flying at 200 feet, low enough that people in the streets could see his face if they looked up at the right moment. Most of them did look up. In a working-class neighborhood of wooden shops and narrow alleys along the eastern bank of the Sumida River in Tokyo, a group of men were working on a rooftop. They heard the engines first. Then they saw the planes coming in low from the east, gray against the pale April sky, moving fast. One of the men raised his arm and waved. He was waving at what he assumed were Japanese aircraft returning from a training exercise. The white star on the fuselage was there to see, if you knew what a white star meant. But why would a Japanese civilian know what an American military insignia looked like? The planes flew over. The man kept waving. At the Imperial Palace, the Emperor's staff noticed nothing unusual. The palace guard had been informed that Japanese aircraft would be conducting training flights over the city that morning. When the first reports of anti-aircraft fire reached the palace, an aide initially assumed it was part of the exercise. The assumption lasted about 30 seconds. Then a bomb hit an industrial facility in the Honjo district. Then a tank farm near the waterfront caught fire. Then the phone lines to the Naval General Staff started ringing all at once. The Japanese anti-aircraft crews reacted the way any unit reacts when confronted with something they were never trained for. Slowly, then wrongly. The B-25s were flying at 200 feet. Anti-aircraft guns are calibrated and angled for targets coming in at 2,000 feet or higher. The gunners elevated their barrels as far down as the mounts would allow. It was not far enough. The shells burst above the planes, or behind them, or simply detonated in open air while the bombers passed underneath and kept going. A few Japanese fighters scrambled from a nearby airfield. They found the B-25s. They could not catch them. A B-25 at low altitude, throttles wide open, is faster than the fighters of 1942 expected it to be. The fighters made passes. They scored no hits on any of the 16 bombers over Japanese airspace, not one. Doolittle dropped his bombs on industrial targets in the northern part of the city. He did not linger. He turned his aircraft south and pushed the throttles forward. He did not look back at the smoke. He did not wait to see the secondary explosions. There was no time and no fuel for anything but flying. The coastline of Japan passed beneath him. Then open ocean, then nothing but water and wind, and the sound of 2 engines that had now been running for nearly 4 hours on fuel that was always going to run short. Doolittle pointed his plane toward China and began doing the math again. Behind him, the other 15 B-25s cleared Japanese airspace one by one over the next 40 minutes. Each crew had bombed their assigned targets: Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe. The damage was real, but not crippling. An oil storage facility, a power station, several factory buildings, a handful of fires that would be put out by evening. By any conventional military measure, the raid had accomplished very little. The Japanese military would assess the physical damage within hours and file a report that said essentially the same thing: minor, containable, militarily insignificant. That report was correct, and it was also completely beside the point, because while the fires were still burning, the phone calls were already happening. Urgent calls, confused calls, from the anti-aircraft batteries, from the naval air stations, from the coastline observation posts, and every call was trying to answer the same question. What were those planes? Not fighters, too big, too slow, not carrier aircraft, wrong shape, wrong engine sound, wrong silhouette entirely. One observer reported twin engines. Another reported 4. A third said the planes had come from the northwest. A fourth said the east. The reports contradicted each other because the men filing them had never been trained to identify what they were looking at. Nobody had trained them, because nobody had imagined this aircraft would ever appear over Japan. The Naval General Staff convened an emergency session within hours of the raid. The question on the table was simple: where did they come from? The B-25. Mitchell is a land-based medium bomber. It requires a long runway to take off. There is no American base within range of Tokyo with a runway that long. Therefore, the B-25s could not have come from a land base. But they also cannot take off from an aircraft carrier. The deck is too short. Everyone in that room knew this. It was a physical impossibility, except that it had just happened. The room went quiet. Someone suggested the planes had launched from a secret base in Soviet territory. Someone else suggested they had been assembled at a hidden airfield in China. A third officer proposed that the Americans had developed a new long-range variant of the aircraft that no one in Japanese intelligence had detected. All three explanations were wrong. None of the men in that room arrived at the correct answer: that an American task force had sailed to within 650 miles of Japan, launched 16 Army bombers off the deck of a Navy carrier, and then turned around and gone home. The correct answer was not on the table because the correct answer was not supposed to be possible. Outside the meeting room, the Japanese government was already working on its public statement. The raid had been minor. The damage was contained. The enemy had attempted to terrorize the Japanese people and had failed. Japanese fighters had engaged the attackers. Some enemy planes had been shot down. This last part was not true. Not one B-25 had been lost over Japan. But the government needed a story that matched what the math said should have happened. And so they built one. The cherry blossoms were still falling in Tokyo that evening. The fires had been put out, the streets were quiet, high above the city, the smoke had thinned to a gray smear across the April sky. In his private cabin aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto sat alone with a report his staff had compiled from all the contradictory accounts. He read it carefully. Then he set it down. And he did something that, in the Japanese Navy, was almost without precedent. He told his chief of staff to take command, and he closed the door. To understand what happened inside that cabin, you have to understand who Isoroku Yamamoto was before April 18, 1942. Not the legend, the man. Yamamoto had opposed the war with the United States, openly, on the record, at personal risk. In 1941, when Japan's military leadership was pushing toward war, Yamamoto told the Prime Minister directly, if Japan fought America for 6 months, they might win. If the war lasted longer than that, he could not guarantee anything. He said this because he had been to America. He had seen the factories. He had driven through the oil fields of Texas. He had watched American workers build things at a scale Japan could not match. He knew what this country could produce when it decided it needed to produce something. His superiors overruled him. The war began. And Yamamoto, loyal to his navy and his emperor, planned the attack on Pearl Harbor with the same cold precision he brought to everything. He delivered Japan its greatest victory. And he spent the months afterward waiting for the part he had always known was coming: the American response. In the weeks before the raid, Yamamoto wrote to close friends about his unease. He told them the people celebrating were wrong. Their sense of safety was borrowed, not earned. He put it simply: the fact that the enemy hasn't come is no thanks to us. It is thanks to the enemy himself. He raised this with the Naval General Staff. He suggested a carrier strike on the home islands was possible. They reviewed the same numbers every other strategist had reviewed. Impossible, they said. Yamamoto let the matter drop. 2 weeks later, 16 B-25s appeared over Tokyo. The report his staff handed him that evening was 12 pages long. It contained conflicting accounts of how many planes had attacked, conflicting accounts of what direction they had come from, conflicting accounts of what type of aircraft they were, and at the bottom, a single line from the intelligence section. Point of origin, unknown. Yamamoto read that line. He already knew what it meant. It did not mean the intelligence section had failed to find the answer. It meant the answer did not exist within the boundaries of what Japanese military planning considered possible. The planes had come from somewhere that was not on any of their maps, not because the location was secret, because the method had never been conceived of. He set the report down. He thought about what he had written to his friends. He had been right, and being right in this particular way was its own kind of devastation. Yamamoto later wrote about the raid. He did not write with anger. He wrote, It is a disgrace that the skies over the imperial capital should have been defiled without a single enemy plane being shot down. Read that sentence carefully. He is not lamenting the damage. The damage was minor, and he knew it. He is not lamenting the deaths. The casualties were small. He is lamenting the sky itself, the sky over Tokyo, over the emperor, over the palace, over everything the Japanese military existed to protect, had been entered by the enemy, and his navy had not stopped it, had not even scratched it. In the culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy, where honor was not a value but a structure, where failure to protect the emperor was not a setback but a personal stain that could not be removed, that sentence carried a weight that no Westerner reading it can fully appreciate. His chief of staff, Admiral Matome Ugaki, sat at his own desk that evening. He opened his diary. Ugaki was not a sentimental man. He was a strategist, a planner, a man who dealt in facts and outcomes. He wrote, "Today, the victory belongs to the enemy." Not, "Today was a difficult day." Not, "Today we suffered a setback." The victory belongs to the enemy. Past tense, settled, without qualification or appeal. The chief of staff of the most powerful naval force in the Pacific had just written in his own hand that on this day, in this contest, the other side had won. Inside the Imperial Navy's high command, the raid broke something that had not broken at Pearl Harbor or at Singapore or at the fall of the Philippines. It broke their certainty. Until April 18, 1942, Japan's military leaders had operated from a foundation of known quantities. They knew the range of American aircraft. They knew the locations of American bases. They knew what the Americans could do, and, more importantly, what they could not. After April 18th, they did not know any of those things anymore. If a medium bomber could take off from a carrier, something every man in that room had considered physically impossible, then what else had they calculated wrong? What other impossibilities were the Americans already planning? The Japanese government moved quickly to control the public story. Newspapers reported the attack as a minor nuisance, a few planes, minimal damage, enemy pilots attempting to terrorize civilians and failing. The word "Doolittle" was translated mockingly as "do nothing." Radio Tokyo broadcast reassurances, but the men who ran the war knew the truth. They had been inside that room when the question was asked and no one could answer it, and they understood in the way that serious military men understand things when they strip away the official statements, that the Americans had just demonstrated they could do something Japan had declared impossible, which meant Japan's entire strategic calculation was now built on a foundation with a crack in it, a crack they could not measure, could not account for, could not plan around, because they still did not know where those 16 planes had come from. That night, on the other side of the world, Jimmy Doolittle was not in a command center. He was not reading intelligence reports. He was in a muddy field in Zhejiang province in China, sitting next to the wreckage of his B-25, which had run out of fuel and gone down in the dark. He had bailed out at 5,000 feet into rain and fog so thick he could not see the ground until he hit it. He had landed hard, picked himself up, found some of his crew, spent the night in a farmhouse whose owner did not speak English and had no idea what was happening. Doolittle sat in the dark and thought about the 16 planes he had left Japan with. Every single one of them was gone, crashed, ditched, scattered across eastern China. Not one had made it to the planned airfield. He had lost an entire squadron of aircraft. He had inflicted, by his own reckoning, minimal damage on the enemy. He told one of his crew that night that he expected to face a military tribunal when he got home. He was not being dramatic. He genuinely believed it. The man who had just changed the course of the Pacific War went to sleep in a Chinese farmhouse convinced he had failed. Before the Doolittle raid, Japan's senior admirals were fighting two wars at the same time, one against the Allies, one against each other. Admiral Yamamoto had been pushing the Naval General Staff toward a single objective since January 1942. He wanted to destroy the American carrier fleet, not damage it, not push it back, destroy it, permanently, so that it could never again threaten Japanese waters. His plan was to seize Midway Island, a tiny atoll 1,200 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was bait. Yamamoto believed that if Japan threatened Midway, the Americans would have no choice but to send their carriers to defend it, and when they did, he would be waiting with the largest naval force ever assembled in the Pacific. 4 fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, hundreds of aircraft. The Americans would come, and he would end the carrier war in a single afternoon. The Naval General Staff was not convinced. They had a different plan. They wanted to push southeast, cut the supply lines between America and Australia, seize the Fiji Islands, New Caledonia, Samoa, strangle Australia into neutrality without ever having to invade it. It was, in its own way, a sound strategy. The two camps had been arguing about this for months. Yamamoto had the stronger personality. The General Staff had the institutional authority. Neither side had yet prevailed. Then April 18th happened. When the smoke cleared over Tokyo and the unanswerable questions settled into the war rooms, the debate ended. Not because Yamamoto won the argument, because the argument no longer existed. The Naval General Staff had spent months insisting that the American carrier force was a manageable threat, something to be neutralized eventually on Japan's own timetable. After 16 B-25s appeared over the Emperor's capital, that position was indefensible. Every objection the General Staff had raised against the Midway Plan dissolved in the same moment the bombs fell. Within days of the raid, the Naval General Staff gave Yamamoto everything he asked for: full commitment to Midway, the largest carrier force Japan had ever assembled, the decisive battle he had been demanding for months. Yamamoto had not changed their minds. Doolittle had done it for him. The first consequence was immediate. Japan pulled 4 full fighter groups out of the Pacific combat zones and stationed them in the home islands. These were not reserve units. These were experienced pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean Campaign, men who had been flying combat missions for months. They were brought home to defend Tokyo against the next raid that everyone now agreed was coming. Those 4 groups stayed in Japan through 1942 and into 1943, sitting on airfields, waiting for American bombers that did not come back. While they waited, the battles that would decide the war were being fought in the Solomon Islands and the waters around Guadalcanal with whatever air power Japan had left. The arithmetic of that absence showed up in every engagement that followed. The second consequence took 6 weeks to arrive. On the 4th of June, 1942, the Japanese carrier strike force approached Midway Atoll. Yamamoto's plan was in motion. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, hundreds of aircraft, the finest naval aviators Japan had ever trained. What Yamamoto did not know was that American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code. Admiral Nimitz knew the attack was coming. He knew the date. He knew the force composition. He positioned 3 American carriers in ambush northeast of Midway, outside the range of Japanese search planes. The Japanese launched their strike against the island, while their aircraft were away from the carriers, rearming on the flight decks for a second wave. American dive bombers found the fleet. In the space of a few catastrophic minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were hit, set ablaze, and abandoned. Hiryu survived the initial attack, launched a counterstrike that badly damaged the USS Yorktown, and was then found and destroyed by a second American wave later that afternoon. 4 carriers, gone in a single day, along with their aircraft, along with their pilots, along with the irreplaceable pool of experience those men had accumulated over years of training and combat. Japan could build new carriers. It could not build new men who knew how to fly off a carrier deck at night, or land on one in heavy weather, or read the wind and the sea the way those pilots could. That knowledge went down with the ships. And it never came back. Yamamoto had wanted the decisive battle. He got it. It just did not go the way he had drawn it, and it would not have happened at all. Not at Midway, not in June 1942, not before Japan was ready. If 16 B-25s had not appeared over Tokyo on a Saturday morning in April and left behind a question nobody could answer. The raid gave Yamamoto his argument. The argument gave him Midway. Midway gave the Americans the Pacific. All of it. Traced back to 80 men and a crack in the foundation of what Japan believed was possible. There is one more consequence. It is the one that gets left out of most histories of the Doolittle raid. When the B-25s crossed into China after leaving Japan, most crews had no choice but to bail out or crash land in the provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi. They came down in fields, on hillsides, in rivers, and the Chinese civilians who found them did what people do when they find frightened, injured strangers who are fighting on your side. They hid them. They fed them. They guided them toward friendly lines, sometimes walking for days through Japanese-occupied territory to do it. Most of the raiders survived because of those people. When the Japanese military learned that Chinese villagers had sheltered the American crews, they launched a reprisal operation across the provinces where the planes had come down. It lasted for months. When it was over, an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians were dead, villages burned, wells poisoned, entire communities erased in retaliation for the crime of helping men who had come from nowhere and could not stay. 250,000 people, for 16 planes, 80 men, 30 seconds over Tokyo. That number does not appear on most of the monuments. It does not come up in most of the celebrations, but it is part of what the raid cost. And anyone who wants to understand what happened on April 18, 1942, has to hold both things at the same time: what the raid accomplished, and what it cost people who had no say in any of it. Jimmy Doolittle spent 3 days getting out of China. He made his way from safe house to safe house, guided by Chinese soldiers and civilians who risked their lives to move him through territory that Japanese troops were already entering in search of the American crews. He eventually reached Chongqing, then India, then Washington. He arrived home in May 1942 carrying something heavier than the mission itself, the conviction that he had failed. He had lost every plane. All 16 B-25s were gone. 3 men had died in the crash landings and bailouts across China. 8 men had been captured by Japanese forces. Of those 8, 3 would be executed by firing squad. 1 would die of illness in captivity. The remaining 4 survived to be liberated in August 1945. Doolittle ran these numbers in his head the entire way home. 16 aircraft destroyed, minimal damage to the enemy, American prisoners in Japanese hands. He sat down and composed his thoughts the way an engineer composes a failure analysis. He listed what had gone wrong. He listed what he would do differently. He prepared himself for the questions he assumed were coming. He told a colleague he expected to be reduced in rank. That is not a figure of speech. He meant it. What he did not know, what no one in his position could have known, Was what his mission had already set in motion in the war rooms of Tokyo. He did not know about the closed door. He did not know about Ugaki's diary. He did not know that the Naval General Staff had abandoned months of strategic argument within days of his bombs falling. He did not know that 4 fighter groups had been pulled from the Pacific and parked in Japan. He did not know that Yamamoto had just received approval for the Midway operation that would end Japan's offensive capability for the rest of the war. He knew none of it. He knew only what he could see: 16 wrecked planes, men unaccounted for, a mission that had lasted 30 seconds over Tokyo and cost everything he had brought with him. President Roosevelt received him at the White House in May. Roosevelt had already decided what the raid meant for the American public. He had been asked by the press where the planes had come from. He smiled. He said they had come from Shangri-La. It was a reference to a popular novel about a hidden paradise in the mountains of Asia. The press loved it. The public loved it. America needed something to love in the spring of 1942. The news from the Pacific had been almost unbroken disaster since December. Wake Island, Bataan, the fall of the Philippines. 80,000 American and Filipino soldiers marched into Japanese captivity. Into that darkness, 16 planes had appeared over Tokyo. That was enough. That was more than enough. Roosevelt awarded Doolittle the Medal of Honor. He promoted him not 1 grade, but 2. From lieutenant colonel straight to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel entirely. Doolittle stood in the White House and told Roosevelt he did not deserve it. He was not being modest. He still believed, genuinely, that the mission had been a failure. Roosevelt disagreed, and history, as it turned out, agreed with Roosevelt. While Doolittle was standing in the White House trying to explain why he should not receive a medal, Admiral Yamamoto was in his cabin aboard the Yamato reviewing the final operational plans for Midway. 2 men, 2 rooms, 1 month apart, one being honored for something he did not believe he had accomplished, one preparing to respond to that accomplishment with the largest naval force Japan had ever assembled. Yamamoto understood what Midway needed to be. It needed to be final. The question that had been hanging over the Japanese High Command since April 18th. Where did those planes come from, and when are they coming back? Could only be answered one way, by destroying the carriers that had launched them. Sink the American carriers. End the question. Restore the perimeter. Restore the certainty. He committed 4 fleet carriers to the operation: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The finest aircrew Japan had, the most experienced carrier pilots in the world. He was so confident in the plan that he brought the entire combined fleet. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, more than 200 ships in total. It was not a battle plan. It was a closing argument. Yamamoto lost. The details of how he lost belong to a different story. What belongs to this one is simpler. He went to Midway because of 16 B-25s. He assembled that armada because a question had no answer, and the question had to be silenced. He lost 4 carriers, hundreds of irreplaceable pilots, and Japan's ability to prosecute an offensive war in the Pacific because the only cure he could imagine for what Doolittle had done was a decisive battle. And the decisive battle destroyed him. Roosevelt's medal. Yamamoto's fleet. One man received an honor he said he did not deserve. One man launched a war he could not afford to lose. Both of them were responding to the same 30 seconds over the same city on the same April morning. The difference was this: Doolittle went to Tokyo not knowing if he would survive. Yamamoto went to Midway not knowing he had already lost. History is sometimes that clean. In April 2019, a 93-year-old man named Richard Cole died quietly in Texas. He had been a co-pilot. He sat in the right seat of the lead B-25 on April 18, 1942, 2 feet to Jimmy Doolittle's right. He was the last of the 80 raiders. When Richard Cole died, the living memory of what it felt like to sit on that flight deck and wait for the signal. The smell of the salt air and the aviation fuel, the sound of the engines turning over in the rain, the way the deck moved under you as the carrier climbed and fell through the swells. All of that ended. It does not exist anywhere anymore except in what was written down. What was written down includes a page from the diary of Admiral Matome Ugaki, April 18, 1942. 7 words. Today, the victory belongs to the enemy. Ugaki did not know the man he was writing about. He did not know Doolittle's name until later. He did not know about the tin can fuel tanks, or the 20-cent bomb sight, or the 8 men sitting in Japanese prisons, or the tribunal Doolittle was preparing himself to face. He knew only the result. 16 planes had come from nowhere. His navy had not stopped them. His admiral had closed the door to his cabin, and the enemy had won the day. There are monuments to the Doolittle raiders. There is a museum. There are plaques. There is a set of silver goblets, one for each of the 80 men, that the survivors used to toast their fallen colleagues at reunions every year until the last of them were gone. When a raider died, his goblet was turned upside down. By the time Richard Cole died in 2019, all 80 goblets were upside down. None of that is what this story is about. This story is about a question. 16 planes appeared over Tokyo and disappeared into China, and no one in the Imperial Japanese High Command could explain where they had come from. That question cost Japan 4 carriers at Midway. It cost Japan 4 fighter groups standing guard over empty skies while the real war moved south. It ended the argument inside Japanese High Command and handed Yamamoto the plan that would be his undoing. And the man responsible for all of it was lying awake in China that first night, not feeling like a man who had changed the war, feeling like a man who owed his country an explanation. The enemy wrote that explanation for him, in 7 words, in a diary, on the night it happened. October 23, 1944, 1400 hours. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the flag bridge of the battleship Yamato. His force had just entered the Sibuyan Sea. Behind him stretched a long column of 23 warships, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. It was the most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled in more than a year. His orders were brutally simple. Steam through the central Philippines. Force the San Bernardino Strait. Turn south. Destroy the American invasion fleet anchored in Leyte Gulf. Everything rested on one quiet assumption. American carrier strength in these waters was only 4 fleet carriers. Perhaps 5. That meant at most 200 aircraft in the air, and among them, no more than 60 or 70 of the new American fighter. The one Japanese intelligence officers had quietly laughed at for nearly 2 years. They called it the Fat Fighter, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. Heavy, clumsy, overbuilt, twice the weight of the Zero, broad wings like a bomber. A loud engine that promised power but no elegance. In the staff rooms and wardrooms, the verdict had long been settled. These Americans do not understand the art of aerial combat. They build big, heavy machines because they lack the spirit and the skill for true dogfighting. The Zero will dance around that lumbering brute all day long. The Hellcat is good for nothing but escorting bombers. Our pilots will cut it to pieces. Japanese admirals mocked Grumman Hellcats. They mocked them with the calm certainty of men who had ruled the Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. But on that warm October afternoon, as Kurita watched the horizon, that comfortable certainty was about to die. The assumption was wrong, catastrophically wrong. Irreversibly wrong. High above the clouds and closing fast from the east waited not 60 or 70 Hellcats, but over 600 of them. 600 Grumman Hellcats, launched from 17 Essex-class carriers. Coordinated by radar systems the Japanese still dismissed as impossible. Flown by pilots America could replace faster than Japan could shoot them down. In the next 48 hours, every mocking laugh the Japanese high command had ever uttered about that fat fighter would be answered in fire, steel, and the roar of 600 engines. This is the story of how the Japanese Navy discovered the terrible truth, how the machine they laughed at ended their empire, and how 600 Hellcats swarmed the skies at Leyte Gulf and changed naval warfare forever. To understand that deep confidence, we must go back before Leyte Gulf. Japanese naval intelligence had recovered pieces of wreckage. They studied captured manuals. They questioned a handful of American pilots. What they saw only confirmed what they already believed. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was heavy, clumsy, over-engineered. Everything the elegant Mitsubishi Zero was not. Fully loaded, it weighed more than 12,500 pounds, nearly twice the weight of a Zero. Its wings were thick and broad, designed more like a bomber than a pure fighter. Its Pratt & Whitney engine produced 2,000 horsepower, but to Japanese eyes it looked slow and lumbering. The plane carried heavy armor plating around the cockpit and engine. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing. Its structure was built to absorb punishment. Japanese engineers noted these features with professional respect, yet the admirals and staff officers dismissed them quickly. These Americans do not understand the art of aerial combat. They build big, heavy machines because they lack the spirit and the skill. The Zero, light and nimble, will dance around that brute all day long. The Hellcat is good for nothing but escorting bombers. Even then, our pilots will cut it to pieces. Captain Toshikazu Omai studied the reports more carefully than most. In a quiet memorandum in late 1942, he acknowledged the rugged construction. He pointed out the self-sealing tanks and the armor, but even he could not escape the prevailing view inside headquarters. The admirals read his notes. They nodded politely, then set them aside. In the wardrooms of the remaining Japanese carriers, the phrase "fat fighter" became a quiet joke. It never grew old. American pilots have to fly these overweight pigs. They lack centuries of samurai tradition. Our Zero pilots, with their years of rigorous training, will make short work of them. Grumman Hellcats? Just another American mistake. Mass-produced, over-armored, hopelessly outclassed. So the mocking settled deep into doctrine. It shaped every intelligence assessment that followed. It colored every plan the High Command drew up. Japanese admirals mocked Grumman Hellcats with the calm certainty of men who had ruled the skies since the first days of the war. They truly believed the new American fighter was second-rate, never meant to challenge the elegance and lethality of the Zero. But history was already preparing a different answer. The first hints that something was changing reached Tokyo in November 1943. During the American landings at Tarawa, 3 carriers operated together as one striking force. Japanese reconnaissance planes reported the new fighter appearing in unusually large numbers. Pilots returning from combat described formations that moved with a precision no one had seen before. Radio intercepts picked up calm, coordinated voice commands, directing dozens of aircraft at once. The reports were noted, filed, then largely set aside. February 1944 brought the big raid on Truk. 6 American carriers struck in a single coordinated blow. Japan lost 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and more than 30 merchant ships in one day. The attacking fighters came in wave after wave. They covered each other with a discipline that Japanese doctrine had always called impossible. Land-based observers described fighter direction that allowed one controller to manage entire squadrons without confusion. By early 1944, the updated intelligence summaries reaching combined fleet staff carried a new tone. American carrier strength now appeared to include at least 9 fleet carriers. 3 more were completing trials. That meant hundreds of the new fighters were already operational. Yet the staff still believed these were only temporary concentrations, not evidence of a deeper shift. The Americans, they reasoned, would still be forced to split their forces. The Atlantic, the Southwest Pacific, convoy duties, all would demand their share. No single operation would ever face more than 4 or 5 carriers at a time. The real turning point came in June 1944 at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Ozawa sailed with 9 Japanese carriers. They carried 450 aircraft in total. Intelligence estimated the American force at 11, perhaps 12 carriers. Ozawa planned to strike first with his longer-range planes, then withdraw beyond enemy reach. What actually met him was 15 American carriers, 7 of them Essex class. They launched nearly 1,000 aircraft that day, more than twice the Japanese total. The American fighters did not simply appear in greater numbers. They were directed by a system the Japanese had dismissed as unworkable. Shipboard radar linked to voice control centers. Japanese strike waves were met 60 miles out, intercepted before they ever saw their targets. Of the 450 Japanese aircraft launched, more than 300 were shot down. American losses were only 29 planes. Ozawa's after-action report was blunt. Enemy fighter strength had exceeded estimates. Coordination was flawless. Replacement was instant. The report asked for immediate reassessment of American fighter production and training. The suggestion was studied, then quietly shelved. Staff officers began to notice new patterns in prisoner interrogations. American pilots spoke casually of squadrons formed only weeks earlier. Training programs in the United States were turning out qualified carrier pilots month after month. Losses that would cripple a Japanese air group were simply absorbed and replaced within weeks. By late summer 1944, the intelligence summaries reaching Kurita's staff carried revised figures. American fighter strength in the Pacific now allowed sustained operations across multiple areas at once. The old belief that the enemy would always be divided and weakened was starting to fray. But Kurita and the planners preparing for Leyte Gulf still operated under the earlier assumptions. They believed the coming battle would be difficult but within reach. They had no idea the real test was only weeks away. The morning of October 24th broke clear and calm over the Sibuyan Sea. Kurita's force was already deep inside Philippine waters, steaming in tight formation toward San Bernardino Strait. Lookouts scanned the horizon for the expected handful of American planes. What appeared instead was something no one on the Japanese bridges had ever seen. At 10:30, the first wave came in from the east. Not a dozen fighters, not even 50, but wave after wave of Hellcats. Their Pratt & Whitney engines droned like a distant thunderstorm that never ended. They flew in perfect coordination. Some climbed high to provide top cover. Others dropped to deck level. They strafed destroyers with 6 heavy machine guns apiece. Behind them came Avengers and Helldivers, but the Hellcats owned the sky. They did not circle and probe. They struck and returned to orbit, waiting for the next group already lifting off from carriers the Japanese could not see. Kurita ordered every anti-aircraft gun manned. The battleships and cruisers threw up a wall of fire. The American fighters simply parted around it. They used the radar-directed discipline that let them time their runs to the second. The super battleship Musashi became the main target. Hellcats raked her decks with machine gun fire. They suppressed the anti-aircraft crews so that the torpedo planes could close in unmolested. One after another, torpedoes slammed into her port side. Bombs from the dive bombers followed, punching through her armor and starting fires that damage control parties could not reach. By noon, Musashi had taken 10 torpedoes and 14 bombs. She slowed. She listed. She began to settle by the bow. Kurita watched from the Yamato's bridge as Hellcat after Hellcat made fresh passes. Their pilots coolly adjusted aim while Japanese gunners exhausted their ammunition. The volume of aircraft never slackened. Every 30 to 40 minutes, a new wave arrived. Fresh planes with full loads, as though the Americans had an endless supply waiting just over the horizon. Kurita tried to calculate the numbers. 4 carriers might launch 60 aircraft at a time. 5 carriers might manage 75. Yet the sky remained full. New formations appeared before the previous ones had even recovered. He radioed Combined Fleet Headquarters for confirmation. The reply came back late in the afternoon. The estimate remained unchanged. 4 or 5 carriers at most. Kurita stared at the message, then looked up at the hundreds of Hellcats still wheeling overhead. The gap between what he was told and what he was seeing had become a chasm. By 1600, Musashi was dead in the water, listing 20 degrees. Her bow almost submerged. The order was given to abandon ship. Over 1,000 men went down with her. After 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits, punishment no single battleship had ever been asked to endure. The force continued west, battered but still powerful, hoping darkness would bring relief. It did not. At first light on October 25th, the Japanese emerged from San Bernardino Strait into the Philippine Sea east of Samar. On the horizon lay what looked like an easy prize. 6 small American escort carriers with a handful of destroyers. Kurita ordered general attack. His battleships opened fire at long range. 18-inch shells from the Yamato arced toward the fleeing carriers. For a few minutes it seemed the Japanese surface fleet might finally close the distance. Then the sky filled again. This time the aircraft were not the improvised Wildcats and Avengers from the escort carriers. These were fleet Hellcats. Hundreds of them, arriving in tight, radar-directed formations from the real American task groups that had never been drawn away. They came from the north, from the east. The first wave alone numbered over 100 planes. The second followed 30 minutes later with 60 more. The third brought 80. They attacked without pause, using the same relentless rhythm Kurita had seen the day before. Hellcats strafed the decks of the heavy cruisers Suzuya and Chikuma. They set fires. They knocked out gun mounts. Torpedo planes, protected by the fighters' constant presence, slid in low and planted hits that slowed the cruisers until they fell out of formation. The Yamato herself twisted and turned. Her massive rudder straining as spreads of torpedoes forced her into violent, evasive maneuvers. Kurita counted the aircraft in each wave and felt the old confidence collapse. The numbers no longer made sense on any chart the Japanese had drawn. 600 Hellcats were not a possibility in the Japanese mind. Yet here they were, covering the sky from horizon to horizon, their engines drowning out even the roar of the Yamato's guns. At 0945, with his cruisers burning and his battleships low on ammunition and surrounded by an endless aerial assault, Kurita ordered withdrawal. The mission was over. His ships turned north, then west, retreating back through the strait under continuous attack. Hellcats pursued them for hours, striking again and again until the Japanese force finally moved beyond effective range. In those 2 days, the American carrier aircraft flew more than 250 sorties against Kurita's fleet in a single afternoon alone, then kept the pressure up the following morning. The fighter direction was flawless. The replacement of damaged planes was instant. The pilots showed no fatigue. Fresh squadrons appeared exactly when the previous ones needed relief. Kurita never saw the carriers themselves. He saw only their aircraft. Wave after wave of Hellcats that refused to end. On the bridge of the Yamato, he stood in silence as the last Japanese hopes for a surface victory in Philippine waters died under that black swarm. The fat fighter he and his staff had once dismissed had become something else entirely. A relentless, coordinated, industrial force that turned the sky into an American domain. The mockery that had begun in quiet staff rooms 2 years earlier ended here. in the roar of 600 engines and the flash of 600 guns, when the surviving ships of Kurita's force limped back to Japanese waters in early November 1944, the High Command could no longer pretend the old estimates held. For the first time since the war began, a full, unrestricted review of American fighter strength was ordered. A small working group of intelligence officers and technical specialists was assembled in Tokyo. They were given access to every scrap of data, prisoner interrogations, captured manuals, radio traffic, reconnaissance photographs. Even reports passed through German channels from neutral observers in the United States. What they uncovered was worse than any battlefield defeat. The radar systems the Americans used were mature shipboard networks. They fed centralized fighter direction rooms where a single controller could speak directly to dozens of pilots at once. The voices on the intercepted tapes never rose in panic. They simply assigned altitudes, headings, and targets, as though directing traffic on a city street. This single capability allowed the Americans to keep 600 Hellcats in the air continuously, rotating fresh flights in and out without ever losing coverage. Even more devastating was the American pilot pipeline. Japan had always relied on a small, elite cadre of pre-war aviators, training replacements slowly and carefully. The United States had turned pilot production into an industrial process. Young men with only a few hundred hours in their logbooks were arriving on new carriers already competent in formation flying, gunnery, and carrier landings. Captured American sailors described training bases where thousands of cadets moved through standardized courses month after month. Losses that would have crippled a Japanese air group were simply absorbed and replaced within weeks. Grumman's factories on Long Island had delivered more than 12,000 Hellcats in just 30 months. The working group ran the figures again and again. Even allowing for every possible error in reporting, the total exceeded anything Japanese industry could have achieved in the same period. The Hellcat was not a handcrafted masterpiece like the Zero. It was a rugged, standardized weapon rolling off assembly lines in a steady flood. Spare parts were interchangeable. Maintenance crews were trained on the same procedures everywhere. A damaged Hellcat could be repaired or replaced faster than a Japanese squadron could mourn its loss. By late December 1944, the working group finished its report. It was 30 pages of cold arithmetic and quiet horror. American fighter strength in the Pacific alone now stood at levels that made sustained Japanese air operations impossible. The gap was not temporary. It was structural. It was permanent. The authors recommended an immediate strategic reassessment at the highest levels of government. The report was stamped above top secret. 8 copies were prepared. They went only to the Emperor's chief naval aide, the Navy Minister, the Chief of the Naval General Staff, and 5 senior planners. No summaries were circulated. No briefings were given to field commanders. No one outside that tiny circle was allowed to read it. The political cost of admitting that Japanese intelligence had been wrong by a factor of 10 was simply unacceptable. To acknowledge the truth would have required explaining to the Emperor and the nation why the war had been allowed to continue long after victory had become mathematically impossible. Vice Admiral Kurita himself returned to Japan in November. He submitted a detailed after-action account describing the volume of enemy aircraft he had faced. His estimate was closer to reality than anything the staff had previously accepted, yet he was never shown the full intelligence report. Instead, he was thanked for his service, quietly relieved of operational command, and reassigned to administrative duties. The war continued anyway. Carrier pilots were still ordered into the air against formations they could never hope to match. Surface ships were still sent forward against skies the Japanese High Command now knew were owned by the enemy. Young men who had barely learned to fly were told to climb into obsolete planes and die for a cause that the handful of men at the very top already understood was lost. The report that could have changed everything was locked away in a few safes in Tokyo, its conclusions buried under layers of silence and pride. The machinery of denial had become more powerful than the machinery of war itself. In the months after Leyte Gulf, the Hellcats simply never left. They filled the sky over Okinawa from April through June 1945. Day after day, week after week, Japanese pilots who still had planes to fly rose to meet them and found the same calm formations waiting, the same steady drone of engines that never seemed to tire. When one Hellcat was hit and spiraled down, two more took its place before the smoke had cleared. The American carriers stayed on station for 82 straight days, launching and recovering aircraft with a rhythm that had become ordinary to them and crushing to everyone else. In February 1945, the same planes appeared over Tokyo itself. More than 100 Hellcats roared in low across the city in broad daylight. This time, there was no single carrier hiding at the edge of range. There were many, working together, their fighters sweeping the sky clear before the bombers even arrived. Japanese civilians looked up and saw something their leaders had once laughed at. An American fighter so common it could be risked in the heart of the home islands. By July, the carriers were cruising openly along the Japanese coast. They struck at will, their Hellcats hunting trains, airfields, and anything that still moved on the ground. Japanese anti-aircraft crews fired until their barrels glowed. Yet the formations overhead simply adjusted altitude and kept coming. When the USS Franklin was nearly sunk by a kamikaze and limped away with hundreds of her crew dead, another Essex-class carrier took her exact place in the line within days. The gap closed before the smoke had even drifted off the water. Kurita lived to see all of it. After the war, he spoke little about Leyte, but in quiet conversations years later, he would sometimes mention the moment he first understood. "Not during the battle itself," he said, "but in the weeks that followed when the reports kept arriving, fresh American squadrons in every engagement. New Hellcats with pilots who flew as though they had been at war for years." He realized then that the sky no longer belonged to anyone in Tokyo. It belonged to the factories on Long Island, and the training fields in Florida, and the calm voices on the radio who never ran out of planes or men. The war ground on for 9 more months. Japanese admirals and pilots continued to fight with the courage they had always shown. But the numbers had already spoken at Leyte Gulf. The fat fighter they had once dismissed had become the most common sight in the Pacific sky. 600 of them had swarmed over Kurita's ships in 2 days, and after that they never really went away. They were there at Okinawa, over Tokyo, along the home islands. Until the very end, Japanese admirals had mocked Grumman Hellcats for 2 years. They had called them overweight, clumsy, and unworthy. Then 600 of them swarmed the skies at Leyte Gulf. And the mockery ended, not with a speech or a surrender, but with the simple, relentless sound of engines that never stopped arriving. The war ended the way it had to after that October afternoon. Quietly, inevitably, under a sky that had changed hands forever.